I was standing in my garage with my phone in one hand and a recording in the other, and I swear the air felt different after Victor Hale's voice came through the speaker. Cold, thin, like the whole room had been emptied out around me. I had to lean against my SUV just to keep my balance, because the man who had asked for my blessing had just said my daughter Maya Brooks was nothing but a bridge to my old client list. The recording was only minutes long, but it felt like something ugly had been living inside it for years. I had made it by accident, or maybe by instinct, I still don't know which. I'd kept my phone tucked away in my pocket. During the ride home from Victor's appointment, the kind of quiet drive where men like him think silence means approval. It was late, the garage door half open, the smell of oil and damp concrete hanging around me, and I remember thinking how normal my life had looked that morning. Coffee on the counter, Maya's text asking if I wanted to come by for dinner this weekend. A life that still had room for ordinary things. That was what made the first part hurt so much. Victor had laughed in the SUV like he was talking about a business deal, not my daughter. He said Maya's law practice would be cute for now, then said it would fade once they were married. Cute. Like her years of work were a hobby she could set on a shelf. I could hear myself breathing on the recording too. Steady, polite, the kind of breathing a man does when he's trying not to let his face give him away. I hated that version of me in that moment, even though I knew why I had stayed calm. Men like Victor always think the quiet ones are harmless. Then he said Phoenix, not as a question, not as a conversation, just a plan. Like he had already packed her life into boxes and decided she would follow wherever he pointed. My fingers went numb around the phone. I nearly let it slip right onto the garage floor. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than his voice for a second, and I remember staring at the concrete, like it might explain how I had let this man sit across from me, smile at my kitchen table, and talk about my daughter as if she were part of his arrangement. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just stood there listening to the last few seconds play out again and again, and the worst part was how calm Victor sounded. That calmness told me everything. He had no idea what he had handed me, and I was still trying to decide whether I wanted justice or something much colder. By the time I started hearing him clearly, it was already a habit to keep my eyes on the road and my face blank in the rearview mirror. Victor liked the passenger seat of my SUV because he thought it made him look important, like my life was just the courtesy shuttle for his. He'd call people on speakerphone before I'd even pulled out of the driveway, and he talked the same way people toss receipts into a trash can, without looking back. Money, timing. When Maya comes around, always Maya. Always my daughter's name wrapped up in his plans like she was an item on a checklist. I told myself I was being patient. That's what good men do, right? They stay calm. They don't make scenes. They let things develop. But patience started to feel less like strength and more like standing in a cold hallway while someone else moved furniture inside my own house. Every appointment, every smooth little smile, every casual insult he let drift through that phone made something tighter in my chest. Not anger at first, something worse. The feeling that he had already decided my place in the world and I was just supposed to accept the outline. He never spoke to me like a person when the calls were going. He'd say, "Hold on, not to me, but into the phone like I was the engine and the steering wheel, and not much else." Once he talked about keeping everything simple after the wedding and laughed like it was harmless. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, but inside I could feel the shape of the lie changing. It wasn't a joke, it was a blueprint. I remember looking at the dashboard lights and thinking how clean they all seemed, compared to what was happening in that seat beside me. The worst part was how ordinary it all looked from the outside. A man in a blazer, an older driver doing a favor, a normal ride through suburban Columbus traffic. If you saw us at a red light, you'd never know I was learning his voice, the way a detective learns a suspect's routine. I started noticing the tiny things. The pause before he said Maya's name, the way he got careful. Whenever money came up, the way he assumed silence meant agreement. People like Victor always mistake quiet for weakness. They build their whole comfort on it. One night I sat in my garage long after he had gone inside, and I listened to a voice memo I hadn't meant to keep. My own hand had recorded him almost by accident, and hearing it back made my stomach turn cold. He had said too much. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. And in that stillness, I understood something I should have understood sooner. Victor didn't fear me. He trusted me. That was his mistake. And if I was willing to stop pretending I hadn't heard him, my silence could become the one thing he never saw coming. I didn't think a kitchen could feel like a courtroom, but the second I pressed play, the whole room changed. Maya was standing by my coffee maker, with her coat still on one hand, wrapped around her mug, like it was the only steady thing left in the world. Victor's voice came out of my phone smooth and careless, the kind of voice that always sounds harmless until you hear what it's really doing underneath. I watched her face lose its color in layers. First her eyes, then her mouth, then that last little bit of hope people keep tucked away when they still want to believe someone is decent. She didn't fall apart. That surprised me so much it almost hurt worse. Her shoulders went rigid, and she set the mug down very carefully, like if she moved too fast the whole room might tilt. Then she asked for the date, the time, whether it had been on speakerphone. 3 questions, clean and sharp, like she was already separating truth from damage. I had heard her use that exact tone with clients before, but hearing it now aimed at the man who was supposed to love her made my throat close up. It was like watching someone turn a key in a lock I didn't even know was there. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to say I should have seen it sooner, that I should have protected her better, that I hated myself for letting him sit at our table and smile like he belonged there. But Maya looked up at me with those steady eyes of hers, and I saw the hurt sitting right beside the anger. Not fighting it, just waiting. That was the part that nearly broke me. My daughter had every right to crumble, and instead, she got quiet. Quiet in a way that meant business. Keep acting normal, she said. That was all. No tears, no speech, no big dramatic promise. Just that. Keep acting normal. I remember staring at her, trying to read the distance in her face, and realizing she had already stepped somewhere I hadn't followed yet. She was thinking 3 moves ahead, while I was still trying to breathe. The silence, after she said it, felt heavy but not empty. It felt loaded, like the moment before a storm door shuts. Then she slid my phone back across the counter and said almost casually, "Do not let him know we heard it." And that's when I understood. Maya wasn't just hurt. She was planning something, and I had no idea how far she was willing to take it. The first thing I noticed was how loud my own kitchen had become. Not with sound, but with the click of my phone screen and the faint buzz of the fridge while I sat there treating my life like a case file. I had never thought I'd be the kind of man who backed up recordings to 2 devices and labeled them by date like some nervous accountant. But Maya set up the cloud account for me, and when I watched the little upload bar crawl across the screen, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. A little less helpless, a little more mine. I started writing everything down in a notebook I used to keep for grocery lists and odd jobs around the house. Dates, times, where Victor called from, what he said when he thought nobody important was listening. Once I got going, the details came back sharper than I expected. His polished voice, the way he always sounded amused, like other people were props in a room he paid for. Putting it on paper made it real in a way memory never does. Memory softens things. Paper does not. Maya told me not to trust my recollection alone, so I called Miss Porter from the den while my coffee went cold beside me. I expected a cold legal voice, maybe a lecture. Instead, she asked calm questions and listened like every word mattered. By the end of the call, I had a clearer picture of what Victor had been circling around, and that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Because once a man like that sees you preparing, he stops looking casual. He starts looking for openings. That shift changed the air in my house. I began checking my phone too often, half expecting his name to light up and half dreading it. Every saved file felt like a brick in a wall I was building with shaking hands. There is something humiliating about learning to protect yourself from someone who smiles at you in daylight. I kept telling myself I was being careful, but part of me knew I was also getting ready for a fight he hadn't admitted he was in. Then Victor called and asked almost offhand if I could bring a folder to his office. Just a folder. That was all he said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I looked at the phone in my hand and felt my stomach tighten. It sounded simple, but nothing with Victor ever was. And the way he paused after he asked, I knew he was waiting to see whether I'd flinch. Victor said paperwork, the way some men say nothing like the word itself should calm me down. He sat at my kitchen table with that polished smile tapping the edge of his coffee cup and talking about documents Maya would sign later, once things were less hectic. I remember staring at his hand and thinking how neat it looked and how wrong everything felt. He wanted the wedding budget routed through him, the guest list simplified, and even her work schedule reconsidered after the honeymoon. Each sentence was wrapped in charm, but the shape underneath was ownership. I kept my face still. That was the hardest part. My whole life, I believed a man should know when to keep his mouth shut, especially in another person's house. But Victor kept going, smiling, like he was doing us all a favor. He mentioned Maya's law practice and laughed softly, like she was tinkering with a hobby in the garage instead of running a real office with real clients depending on her. That laugh landed wrong in my chest. It wasn't confidence. It was too quick, too thin. A man that's sure of himself doesn't need to cut down someone else's success just to feel taller. So I asked him, as calm as I could, what exactly he meant by after marriage. He blinked once, just once. Then he said it was only practical that couples made these decisions together, that he wanted to protect the family. I'd heard that kind of language before, from men who wanted a say in everything except their own behavior. I could almost hear the gears turning behind his eyes, like he was trying to close a gate before anyone noticed it was already open. Then I mentioned Maya's law practice again, just casually, and that's when his smile slipped for half a second. Not enough for anyone careless to notice. Enough for me. His voice stayed smooth, but something under it tightened like a string pulled too far. He was afraid she would read the paperwork, rid him, and see the small, desperate man hiding inside all that shine. That was the first time I understood the real danger. Not that he wanted control, but that he knew exactly how badly he needed it. And once I saw that I couldn't unsee it. Then he reached for another sip of coffee and asked me where Maya would be working after the wedding. As if he already had the answer. The weird part was how calm Maya sounded after she said it. Not cold, not numb, just steady, like she had finally found the floor after being pushed around in the dark. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, staring at his latest text, and she told me to stop replying to anything that made my stomach tighten. Let him talk, she said. People like Victor always trip when they start rushing. I hated that she was right. I hated that her life depended on patience and screenshots and a private email account she had set up for me, like we were building a shelter out of paper and rules. So I did exactly what she said. Every message went to her private email. Every weird little sentence, every smooth half-promise, every question that felt too polished to be innocent. I forwarded it all and left his texts sitting there unanswered. It made me feel powerless at first, like I was swallowing my own words. But then I started seeing the pattern. When I didn't react, Victor wrote more. When I didn't reassure him, he got sloppy. He filled the silence with explanations nobody asked for. There is something revealing about a man who cannot stand still when he thinks he's losing control. Maya never raised her voice once. She only asked me for facts, dates, screenshots, the exact wording. She had that lawyer habit of separating the mess into pieces, like she was sorting through a drawer full of tangled jewelry and refusing to let one chain define the rest. I remember looking at her across my counter and feeling this painful mix of pride and grief. Pride because she was sharp enough to protect herself. Grief because she had to be. No daughter should have to turn her own wedding into a legal strategy just to stay safe. We made one other decision that night. We would not warn Victor, not a hint, not a nervous little slip, nothing. If he wanted to keep building his little fantasy, we would let him. I could feel the risk of it, but I could feel the justice too. He thought he was guiding the whole thing, nudging us where he wanted us to go. He didn't understand that he was already stepping onto a stage we had set in motion long before he noticed the curtains. Later, Maya said the venue was booked, the guest list was nearly finalized, and the timeline was exactly where it needed to be. She said it like she was talking about weather, but I heard the steel underneath it. I looked at the wedding details spread across my table and suddenly felt the room tilt. Victor was smiling into a trap and calling it a future, and I still had no idea how far he was willing to go when he finally realized the floor wasn't his anymore. By the time Victor stood up, the room had already settled into that polite, expensive silence people wear at engagement dinners. The candles were steady, the glasses were full, and everyone was doing that careful little smile Americans do when they think they're watching something happy. I knew better. I could feel it in my shoulders before he even opened his mouth. The way a storm shows itself in the pressure, not the rain. He leaned back like he owned the air in the room and started talking about Phoenix. Not as a question, not as a conversation, as a decision dressed up as a gift. New office, better weather, fresh start, more opportunity for both of us. He said it so smoothly that for half a second, I almost understood why people trusted him. That was the dangerous thing about men like Victor. They wrap control in a ribbon and wait for everyone to call it generosity. Maya sat beside him with that same polished expression I'd seen her use in court when someone tried to corner her with a bad question. Her smile was there, but it was thin, like painted glass. I caught the tightness at the edge of her jaw, the tiny pause before she set her fork down. Nobody else seemed to notice. They were too busy nodding, too busy being impressed by the fantasy he was feeding them. I wanted to reach across the table and stop him, but Maya had already warned me what he would do if I moved too early. Then he started passing out printed travel plans. Neat little packets, dates, flights, apartments to tour, school districts if we ever had children, which made my stomach turn, because he was already arranging a life he had not earned the right to plan. He handed one to me with a grin that said he expected gratitude. I looked down at the paper and felt something in me go very still. He had just put his hand on the evidence without even knowing it. That was the moment I understood the real mistake. It wasn't the move. It was the audience. He had announced his control in front of witnesses, family donors, people who would remember the way he said it, the way Maya's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I saw one of his business friends glance at Maya, then back at Victor, and I knew the room had shifted. Quietly, permanently. Victor kept talking, enjoying himself laying out Phoenix like it was already signed and sealed. I sat there listening, almost calm now, because I could feel the trap closing around him instead of us. He thought he was building a future. He was actually building a record. And when he finally looked at Maya for approval, I saw it in her face. She was letting him hang himself with his own words. What he said next was going to matter more than he realized. The ballroom looked like it had been wrapped in someone else's promise. Polished floors, warm chandeliers, white linen, and enough flowers to make the whole room smell expensive. Victor had paid for every inch of it, and he kept glancing around like the place itself was applauding him. I stood near the back with my coffee gone cold in my hand, watching him work the room, and all I could think was how much men like him love a stage when they believe they wrote the script. Maya moved through the guests with that calm, careful smile she used in court when she already knew where the argument was going to land. She had tucked a tiny recorder feed where no one would notice it. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just enough to catch Victor cleanly when he got comfortable. I helped her earlier, my fingers shaking more than I wanted to admit. It felt strange, almost sacred, like we were laying down a track before the storm arrived. Not to make trouble, to preserve reality. Victor kept talking about the future the way some people talk about a vacation they've already booked for everyone else. He thanked donors, joked with his business friends, and kept trying to steer the conversation toward Phoenix without ever sounding like he was steering it. But I could hear the push under every sentence. It had the polished feel of a sales pitch with the bottom line hidden in small print. He thought charm would carry him. He never understood that charm is only power when no one is paying attention. One of his business partners asked Maya almost casually whether she planned to keep her law practice after the wedding. I watched Victor's smile tighten for half a second, then reset like a cracked picture frame being adjusted on the wall. That tiny hesitation told me everything. He wanted the room to see him as generous, but generosity was just another costume on him. Underneath, he needed Maya to fit inside whatever shape he had already decided was convenient. I felt my chest go tight, then strangely quiet. That kind of quiet always comes right before truth gets spoken aloud. Maya caught my eye across the room just for a moment, and I knew she felt it too. We weren't trapped anymore. We were collecting the room piece by piece, and Victor was the one handing it over. Then he lifted his glass and started talking about where we would be living after the wedding. The question was so ordinary that I almost missed it. Victor's business partner only asked where Maya saw her practice going after the wedding. Nothing sharp, nothing loaded, just the kind of polite small talk men use when they want to sound interested. But Victor went still for half a second, and in that tiny pause, I saw something ugly and real slip out from under his smile. It was like watching a polished door crack open and finding a bare room behind it. He answered too quickly, too neatly. He said Maya was thinking about scaling back for a while, and he laughed when he said it. Like her career was a side hobby she could fold up and tuck away. I felt my hands go cold around my water glass. That was the moment it hit me. He didn't sound secure. He sounded cornered. A confident man doesn't need to talk over a woman's life to feel taller. He just stands there. I looked at Maya across the room, and she was smiling with that careful, controlled expression she used in court when someone underestimated her. I knew that face. I had seen it when she was hurt, furious, and refusing to give the room the satisfaction of watching her crack. Victor didn't love that strength. He feared it. He needed her dimmed down, quieted, made smaller, in the same way a man shades a lamp, because he can't stand the room being brighter than he is. And that realization stung in a way I wasn't ready for. It wasn't just that he had lied to us. It was that he had been measuring her all along. Not as a person, but as a threat to his ego. Every compliment, every "I support your work," every smooth little promise had been paper thin. Underneath it, he wanted a woman who would make him look impressive without making him feel exposed. That isn't love. That's ownership dressed up for a nice dinner. I sat there and felt something in me settle into place, heavy and clear. I had spent months trying to understand why a man would invest this much effort in controlling a wedding, a house, a future. Now I knew. He wasn't building a life with Maya. He was building a stage where he could always stand one step higher than her. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. But the worst part was realizing he still thought nobody else had noticed. The paper lay between us like something alive waiting to be fed our signatures. I remember the way Maya held it first. Not with fear exactly, but with that still narrow focus she gets when she already knows a room is lying to her. She didn't say much. She just slid the draft agreement across my kitchen table and let me read. By the second page, my stomach had gone hard and cold. It wasn't a wedding document. It was a leash made out of polite language. There were clauses about financial harmony, shared decision-making, and a little buried line about my daughter's professional availability after marriage. That one sat in my chest like a stone. Victor had written access into the future he was selling her, as if her calendar, her clients, even her phone calls were already his to manage. I kept reading because I needed to know how deep it went, and the deeper it went, the more my hands started to shake. Maya's voice was quiet when she said, "He thought I'd just sign where he pointed." She wasn't crying. That was almost harder. I could hear the heat underneath her calm, the kind that comes right before a boiler starts rattling. I looked at her name typed into that draft beside all those tidy, poisonous phrases, and I felt ashamed that I had ever let myself believe Victor's charm might mean something good. Some men don't bring a ring. They bring a contract and call it love. We took it straight to Ms. Porter that afternoon. Her office smelled like old books and coffee, and she read the pages the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. She didn't waste time. She tapped one paragraph with her pen and told us it was suspicious. Another, she said, was likely unenforceable. Then she pointed to the part that tried to limit Maya's work and said that right there is where he stops being romantic and starts exposing himself. I sat there listening, feeling something in me finally straighten. Ms. Porter told us to keep the draft, keep every text, keep every version he sent. People who try to control you in writing usually think paper makes them clean, she said. It doesn't. I almost laughed, but my throat was too tight. Walking out of that office, I felt steadier and angrier. Victor wasn't just circling Maya. He was trying to draw walls around her life while smiling through dinner. And once I saw the shape of it, I realized he had left his fingerprints everywhere. So what else had he already hidden? The woman at the credit union had the kind of calm voice that made me trust her before I even sat down. Her name tag said Linda, and the little office smelled like printer paper and lemon cleaner. Ordinary, almost boring, which was exactly what I needed. I slid my driver's license across the desk and heard myself say, "I need to separate what's mine." My voice came out steadier than I felt. That surprised me. So did the fact that my hands only trembled once, right when she asked if I wanted to change the direct deposit and take Victor off anything that could still reach me. I hated how much that question fit my life now. I had always been the man who paid his bills on time, kept a simple checking account, never made a fuss. I used to think suspicious people were always looking for trouble. Then Victor started smiling through dinner while asking questions that sounded harmless and landed like hooks. By the time Linda opened my account history and pointed out the shared transfers, the little temporary reimbursements, and the notes that didn't match the dates Victor had given me, I felt something inside me settle into place. Not peace, something sharper, like a puzzle clicking shut. Linda printed out the records and slid them toward me one page at a time, never rushing, never pitying me. I could have kissed her for that restraint. She let me read in silence while the pattern unfolded itself. One email here, one bank transfer, there one text that suddenly made a whole week look different. It was all there if you stopped wanting it to be innocent. That was the ugly part. I had to admit I'd been hoping for confusion, because confusion still leaves room for excuses. The truth did not. When I left, I stood in the parking lot for a second too long, holding those papers against my chest like they were keeping me upright. The sky over suburban Columbus was flat and gray, and the cold air felt clean in my lungs. I remember thinking that a storm doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it starts with the silence, after you finally close the door. Victor still thought I was the quiet father in the background, the man who nodded and carried plates and stayed out of the way. He had no idea I was holding the map now. And once you know where all the roads lead, what exactly do you think happens next? The call came in while I was standing at my kitchen sink staring at a plate I had already washed twice. That alone told me how far Victor had gotten under my skin. He had me second-guessing ordinary things. Soap, time my own habits. His voice had been circling me for days in little pieces, never loud enough to accuse, just soft enough to plant doubt. He kept hinting that Maya was swamped, that she was hard to reach, that maybe I should let someone else help me sort through things. I knew what he was doing, even while I told myself not to overreact. That's the part that made my stomach turn. Manipulation never arrives wearing a name tag. It comes in sounding concerned. Then the wellness check request hit like a cold draft through a cracked window. The officer was polite, almost apologetic, and that somehow made it worse. I stood there in my own doorway, trying to answer simple questions, while Victor's shadow sat in the room with me invisible, but heavy. They wanted to know if I was alone, if I understood why they were there, if anyone had been helping me manage my affairs. I remember feeling the heat rise in my face, because I could see how easy it would have been for him to twist my hesitation into a story about a confused old man who couldn't be trusted with his own life. If I had been lonely enough, scared enough, tired enough, that little performance might have worked. That thought stayed with me long after they left. Maya arrived not long after, still in her work clothes, her hair pinned back the way it always was when she was thinking hard. She didn't waste a second on outrage. She asked me to hand her every text, every voicemail, every strange little message Victor had sent. We sat at my table with her laptop open and my phone between us, and the room felt different once we started saving everything. Smaller, but steadier. Like we were putting walls back, where he had been trying to cut holes in them. When Ms. Porter called, she told us to keep every message and never answer a suspicious request without letting her see it first. Her voice was calm in that way that makes you trust her more, because she didn't need drama to understand danger. "Let him keep talking," she said. "People who are confident don't usually rush." I wrote that down on a yellow note and stuck it to the fridge. For the first time, Victor didn't feel clever to me. He felt reckless. And reckless men leave patterns all over the floor. If you know where to look, the church basement smelled like coffee-baked beans and old carpet that had seen too many winters. I should have felt safe there. Instead, I felt like I was sitting in the middle of a slow-moving leak. Victor came in, wearing that polished smile of his, the one that always looked effortless until I watched the corners of it tighten. He shook hands, complimented the casseroles, laughed a little too loudly, and kept acting like he belonged in every room he entered. But I noticed what he was really doing. He kept checking whether Maya was watching him, like her eyes were the only mirror that mattered. That told me more than any speech could have. I stayed quiet and let him talk. That was the part that used to make me feel small, but not that night. That night's silence felt like bait. Victor loves an audience, until the audience starts noticing the seams in his act. He made a joke about helping Maya balance everything after the wedding, and one of the women from the choir, Dot Sullivan, gave me that look older women give when they've heard enough to know there's more underneath. She didn't say a word right away. She just kept folding her napkin and watching Victor the way you watch weather coming in over a flat field. He kept going, which was exactly what I wanted. He talked about Phoenix like it was a done deal. Talked about Maya's work, like it was flexible. Talked about how marriage is about making adjustments. Every sentence sounded friendly if you weren't listening closely. But I was listening closely, and so were a few other people by the end of it. One man near the coffee urn asked a careful question, and Victor answered too fast. Another woman, Carol Henderson, mentioned seeing Maya at the office and said something polite that should have ended the conversation. Instead, Victor kept reaching for control with both hands, and every time he did, he showed a little more of what he was trying to hide. When the potluck started winding down, Dot came over and touched my sleeve. She told me very calmly that she had heard enough to remember it if anyone ever needed her to. Carol said almost the same thing in different words. I didn't have to beg. I didn't have to explain. That kind of relief is quiet, but it lands heavy in the chest. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and that strange ringing silence in my ears. Victor still thought he was charming everybody, and I knew better. His image wasn't breaking all at once. It was leaking drop by drop. and I wondered how long before he noticed the floor was already wet. The papers were still there when the kitchen finally went quiet, spread across my table like they were waiting for someone wiser than me to read them. I kept staring at Victor's messages, the banknotes, the dates written in Maya's neat hand, and I hated how much I wanted one last loophole. Not because I trusted him anymore. I didn't. It was something sadder than that. I wanted the version of him he kept pretending to be, to exist long enough to make this hurt less. Maya didn't rush me. She sat across from me with both hands around her coffee mug, letting the silence do its work. That was one of the reasons I leaned on her so hard. She never made me feel stupid for needing a minute to catch up with the truth. When I finally looked up, she was watching me with that calm, sharp face she gets when she knows exactly what I'm trying not to say. I felt seen in a way that almost made me flinch. I know she said softly, like she was answering a question I hadn't asked out loud. That broke something open in me. Not all at once, just enough. Because I realized I wasn't mourning Victor. I was mourning the idea that good manners and expensive flowers could still hide a rotten core. I'd spent so many years believing people showed you who they were eventually. And here he was, showing me in high definition, while I still kept reaching for the blurry version. Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her palm was warm, steady, and it grounded me better than any speech could have. Then she said, "Love without honesty is just a trap with pretty flowers on it." I let that sit between us. It fit too well. A trap with ribbon on it. A polished little cage. That was Victor's whole style, really. Glossy on the outside, suffocating underneath. I looked at the kitchen light reflecting off the stacked pages and felt my stomach tighten, because tomorrow he was going to walk into a ballroom thinking he owned the room. Maya gathered the documents into a single stack and slid them toward me. "Be ready," she said. "When he starts talking, don't look away." I nodded, but my hands were still shaking under the table. And when I asked her one last time if she was sure, she just looked at me and said, "I've never been more sure of anything." Then she stood up, and I knew the quiet was ending. The first thing I noticed was how certain Victor looked when he stood up. Not happy, not relaxed. Certain like the room had already agreed with him before he even opened his mouth. He raised his glass, smiled that polished smile, and started talking about Phoenix like it was a done deal, like Maya's life had already been packed into a box and labeled in his neat little handwriting. I sat there with my hands folded so tight, my knuckles ached, and I watched him look right past her as if she were some ornament he had already chosen where to place. That was the moment the air changed for me. Not because he said anything dramatic, but because he said it so casually. Men like Victor always tell on themselves when they think the room belongs to them. He talked about the new office, the fresh start, the future they'd be building, and every word landed wrong like a key turning in a lock. He thought nobody else could hear. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could also feel something else, Maya's stillness beside him, the kind that isn't passive at all, the kind that means a woman has already made her peace with what's coming. I looked around the reception and saw exactly why Maya had wanted this many witnesses. Her aunt was at one table, his investors were near the front, and that one careful man from Victor's office sat with the expression of somebody finally hearing a voice note played back at full volume. Nobody was whispering. Nobody was distracted. Victor had given his little speech in the worst possible room in front of the exact people whose opinions he needed. It felt almost unreal, like watching a man build his own stage and then trip over the edge of it. He kept smiling at the guests, but every time he glanced at Maya, he looked through her instead of at her. That hurt in a way I didn't expect. Not because I still believed in him, I didn't, but because I understood all at once that this was never about love for him. It was about placement, about control, about making sure she fit where he wanted her to fit. And the worst part, he sounded so smooth doing it that I knew he'd practiced this speech in his head 100 times. Maya didn't flinch. She just lifted her chin a fraction, and I saw it then. The trap wasn't waiting anymore. It was open. All Victor had to do now was keep talking. And he always did love the sound of his own voice. The second I heard my chair scrape back, the whole room seemed to lean toward me. Not because I was important, because silence makes people curious, and in a room like that, curiosity is louder than any speech. I crossed to the sound system, feeling every eye follow me, but I kept my hands steady. That mattered to me more than courage. Steady hands mean you still own yourself. I had chosen the cleanest recording for a reason. No background noise, no awkward pauses, no room for Victor to wriggle out of it. Just his voice. Smooth, pleased with itself. Talking about Maya like her future was a scheduling problem. I hit play, then stepped back. The first few words came out calm enough to fool anyone who hadn't been listening for months. Then the meaning landed. His bragging about treating her career like a temporary phase, about placing her where he wanted her after the wedding. It sat in the air like smoke no one could pretend not to smell. The reaction was immediate. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A woman near the center table made a small sound I'll never forget, like the floor had shifted under her chair. Someone at the far end muttered, "Oh my God," and then nothing else. I didn't look at them for long. I watched Victor instead, because I wanted to see the exact moment his confidence cracked. It was almost cruel how fast his face changed. The color drained out of it so quickly I thought of paper left out in the rain. All structure gone soft. He opened his mouth like he was about to explain it away, but I kept the recording going. That was the part that mattered. Men like Victor count on momentum. They talk over discomfort, over doubt, over any room that starts to wake up. I wasn't giving him momentum. I was giving him a mirror. And the mirror was speaking for me. Maya didn't move. She just sat there so still it looked like she'd stepped outside her own body for a second, and I understood then how much restraint it takes to let truth do its work. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch. Let everyone hear the exact sound of a man who thought he was charming enough to hide his cruelty. He had spent months wearing confidence like a tailored suit, and now the seams were splitting right there in front of everybody. Then I saw him glance toward the door, and I knew he was already thinking about whether he could get out before the next recording started. His laugh came out thin, like paper held too close to a flame. That was the first thing that told me he was cracking. Not the words, not even the way his face kept trying to reset itself into charm. It was the tiny failing rhythm underneath it all. The way a man can sound when he realizes the room is no longer his stage. I had seen Victor Hale polished-centered, perfectly sure of his place in the world. But in that moment, I was looking at panic wearing expensive cologne. He started talking fast, too fast. He said I had misread everything. Then he said Maya had planned this from the beginning, like the truth had somehow sprung up overnight and not been sitting there in plain sight for months. Then he turned to the room and implied people were enjoying watching him struggle because they were jealous. That one almost made me laugh, but it came with so much contempt that my stomach tightened instead. It was like watching a man kick at a locked door and blame the hinges for not opening. Maya didn't interrupt him. She just stood up slowly, and I swear the whole ballroom leaned with her. The ring came off her hand with a motion so calm it felt louder than any speech. I remember thinking how much courage it takes to be that still when someone has been trying to bend your life around his own comfort. She set the ring down and said very clearly that she had already spoken to Ms. Porter. No shaking, no pleading, just a clean line cutting through everything he'd built. Victor's face changed in a way I will never forget. He reached toward her, then stopped. Not because he suddenly respected her space, not because he had grown decent in the last 10 seconds. He stopped because he saw the phones up around the room, the little glowing screens held steady by people who were finally paying attention. That was the moment I understood how much of his power depended on privacy, on silence, on everyone else being too polite to look too closely. Once the room started recording, his hand lost its nerve. The silence after that felt heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of judgment, full of people finally seeing what had been hiding in the open, and Victor, for all his polished clothes and practiced smiles, looked smaller with every second he couldn't control. I had waited a long time to see the mask fall apart, but I still wasn't ready for what happened when it finally did. The room did not relax after Victor sat back down. It stayed rigid, like everyone in it had just found out the floorboards were thinner than they looked. People kept their eyes on their plates, their phones, the centerpieces, anywhere but on him. I noticed his business partner standing near the wall, a man who had been smiling politely 10 minutes earlier, now staring at Victor like he had finally seen the price tag. He left before dessert, just nodded once to no one, and walked out with that quiet, finished kind of anger that does not need a speech. I remember thinking that was the real beginning of it. Not the recording, not Maya taking off the ring. That walk to the door. That was the moment the room understood Victor was not untouchable, and once people understand that they start remembering everything. Victor tried to keep talking after that, but it sounded like furniture being moved around in an empty house. Too much noise, no purpose. A few guests slipped out while pretending they had a reason, and I did not blame them. Nobody wants to be the last person holding a glass in a room where the truth has already been served. I stood there with my hands flat at my sides, feeling every second of his embarrassment as if it were its own weather system. By morning, his polished announcement was gone from social media. Just removed. No explanation that would help him. No elegant rewrite. I saw the blank space on my phone and felt only a tired kind of relief. Then Maya called to tell me her paperwork was filed. The wedding was canceled, and every legal thread she could reach had been cut before he could pull it tighter. Her voice was steady, but I heard the strain underneath it. The kind that comes from surviving something expensive. Later I learned his employer wanted a formal ethics review. I did not celebrate that. I did not need him ruined. I needed him stopped. There is a difference, and people who have been cornered for too long know it in their bones. I sat at my kitchen table that night, looking at the dark window over the sink, and for the first time in months I did not jump at every sound in the house. I slept without listening for his call. That small silence felt bigger than victory. But the strange part was, it still did not feel finished. The first box felt heavier than it should have, not because of the books inside it, but because I was carrying a whole version of my life that had gone stale in that old house. Every time I walked back through the front door, the silence was different now. Not empty, just honest. The rooms did not feel haunted anymore. They felt relieved, like they had been waiting for us to admit we were done pretending. Maya was already in her apartment near downtown Columbus when I made the next trip. Hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, directing boxes into corners as if she had been doing it for years. She looked tired, in that deep, steady way people look after they have survived something and refuse to let it own them. I watched her tape a label across a stack of legal files and thought not for the first time, oh, that strength is sometimes just a person standing upright while their heart is still catching up. Then the first casserole arrived, and then another. Mrs. Sullivan from church came by with a foil tray and a soft voice that never asked too many questions. My neighbor Carol Henderson showed up with coffee in a paper carrier and said, "You finally let people help." I almost laughed at that because she was right. For too long I had mistaken silence for dignity. It turns out dignity can look a lot more like accepting a hot meal and letting somebody carry a box. The apartment slowly filled with ordinary life. A lamp, a basket of mail, Maya's law books lined up beside a candle that smelled like lavender and rain. I sat on the edge of the couch for a minute, listening to the noises of a real place. The hum of the fridge, the scrape of packing tape, Maya humming under her breath. There was no performance in it, no polished smile, just life unclenched. I kept my recordings in a drawer beside the kitchen table, not because I wanted to live in that old fear, but because I needed to remember how easily charm can wear a tie and call itself love. Maya said she was keeping her practice open, and I could hear the certainty in her voice. She was not rebuilding from ashes. She was choosing what stayed. And standing there in that small apartment with church ladies' casseroles on the counter and my neighbor's coffee going cold, I finally understood something I should have known sooner. Love without respect is just control in a nice suit. But then Maya looked at me and asked very quietly, "Did we save enough?" And I realized I still had one more truth to face. The room didn't stay loud for long. Once the recording ended, the silence felt heavier than noise ever could. Then the judge stepped in with that calm voice that makes a courtroom go still in a different way. And Victor's whole face changed when Ms. Porter stood up and laid out the paper trail. The messages, the draft agreement, the timing every small lie he thought would stay hidden. The judge didn't just reject his side of the story. He ordered sanctions, referred the matter for a formal ethics review, and made it clear that any lawyer willing to help dress up this mess would be hearing from the bar. Victor sat there like the air had left his chest. His business partner wouldn't look at him. Nobody did. I watched him reach for words and find none. That was the part I will never forget. The first time in years Victor had no room left to perform. I didn't feel triumphant the way people in movies do. I felt quiet, tired in my bones. But it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after you've been holding a door shut for too long and finally let it swing open. I kept thinking about how close I came to saying something too early to letting anger hand him an escape route. If I had, he would have painted me as emotional, confused, desperate. Anything but right. Instead, I let him keep talking until he hung himself with his own certainty. That lesson stayed with me. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait long enough for the truth to stand up on its own. Afterward, Maya and I sat in her apartment with takeout containers nobody touched and the late afternoon light sliding across the table. She looked smaller for a minute, not weaker, just human. I saw how much she had carried alone, and I saw how proud she was not to let it own her. I had spent so many years thinking protection meant speaking first, speaking loudest. But real protection, I learned, can look like patience receipts and the refusal to beg someone to be decent. The pain didn't break me. It showed me exactly who I was when somebody tried to corner the people I love. Now I can spot that old trick from a mile away. The charm that arrives to polish the pressure disguised as planning the way they try to make you doubt your own memory, so they can write the ending for you. I've lived long enough to know that people like Victor don't fear love. They fear being seen clearly. And once they are, they usually crumble under the weight of their own mask. I kept the recordings not because I need to relive that season, but because I never want to forget what truth looks like when it finally gets a seat at the table. If someone you trusted started planning your daughter's whole future behind her back, like she was never meant to have a say, would you have kept quiet long enough for the truth to finish him? Or would you have said something that gave him a way out?